We're very pleased to welcome Professor Michelle Herman to give the Emeritus Academy lecture for this month. And she's going to be speaking about her latest book, If You Say So. And it's my understanding that this is about true stories about loss and reinvention, friendship and community, family and home, and dance, which is a dedicated practice of which led her down an unexpected, wholly surprising new pathway. Professor Herman's a graduate of Brooklyn College and also the University of Iowa with her expertise in creative writing. She, in fact, was in charge of the creative writing program here at Ohio State twice during her tenure on the faculty. She has written numerous books and essays and short stories. And in looking over her very impressive CV, there were many honors and things of note. But the two that I really found attractive were two awards. One was for undergraduate teaching and mentoring from the College of Humanities. And another one was she won the Outstanding Teacher Award from the College of Arts and Sciences in 2005. And so we're looking forward to the lecture today from Professor Herman. And thank you for offering to give this lecture. And thank you all for coming to hear it. Okay, thanks.
Now I should be on. Oh, that sounds good, right? Okay. So lecture is a very fancy word for what I'm going to do. I never lectured in all my many years teaching, and I don't intend to lecture today. I don't like being lectured to either, to tell you the truth. I'm going to read to you from this new book. The beautiful cover is a painting by my husband, who's a graduate of OSU's MFA painting program from many years ago, Glenn Holland. And his paintings are featured throughout the book. So my mini advertisement is, if you enjoy the bits that I'm going to read and what I have to say about the book, I did bring some copies of the deluxe edition, which, Susan, I'm sorry to say I didn't have when last time I saw you. But there are full color reproductions of Glenn's paintings inside, and they are really more than worth the price of admission just to see these incredible paintings. So this is my 10th book and my 4th collection of personal essays, or we could call it autobiographical nonfiction, or I like to call it memoir plus, because it's about my life, but it's always about something. I get a little bored reading people's memoirs, especially regular people like myself. It's one thing to read the memoir of Hillary Clinton. It's another thing to read the memoir of someone who's been a college professor for almost 4 decades and sat alone in a room writing the rest of the time. My other books are fiction, novels, stories, novellas. I have a second, not so secret life as an advice columnist, a job I got 6 years ago that it turns out I was born for, and that teaching undergraduates and graduate students in creative writing for a long time very well prepared me for, since much of my job involved giving people advice about their lives. So I have a column that runs every Sunday in Slate magazine online. But the writing of personal essays is something I came to late. I had been writing fiction, honestly, since I was 7 years old. You'll hear that from a lot of writers. And had been writing professionally since I was in my early 20s, publishing my work. I had never written anything true. I never wanted to write anything true. In fact, I made fun of creative writers who wrote about their lives. My attitude was, why waste that good material? When you could use it, you can take a little of this and a little of this and make fiction out of it. But I fell prey to it myself in the weeks after 9/11, when I found that for the first time in my life, for the first time since before I was 7 years old, I couldn't write. I, you know, I kept thinking, why would anyone care about made up people saying and doing made up things and thinking and feeling made up things? It seemed really irrelevant. And I think a lot of us felt that what we were doing at that moment felt irrelevant. But I kind of, it was like I have an addiction to writing. And as the weeks went by, I got more and more anxious because I wasn't writing. I didn't want to write and I wasn't writing, but I was teaching and I felt like a fraud telling my students that they needed to be writing every day and giving them deadlines. And so just to get myself going, I started writing some true things down. And that turned into my first book in short order. It was called The Middle of Everything, and it's about motherhood and daughterhood, two subjects I am preoccupied with. So as the years have passed, I've written nonfiction on a lot of different subjects. And this book began in large part because 8 years ago, improbably enough, at the age of 62, and while still teaching full-time and writing, I took my first ballet class at a brand new dance studio that opened in Clintonville around the corner from where I lived, and fell in love. And since that day, with the exception of when I am out of town to take care of my mother or to give a reading, or the rare times I take a vacation, I have been there every day. I take ballet class 6 days a week, and on the seventh day, I do only yoga. And on those 6 days, I don't only do ballet. I do ballet, and I do jazz, I do ballet, and I do contemporary. I dance a lot. I spend every evening dancing, and I spend every Saturday and Sunday all day. On Sunday, I take 4 classes. And I thought it might be a passing thing, but apparently it is not. I had never, I mean, I had taken modern dance class as a child, briefly. But this has become my new, I guess, my avocation. And I perform, and I've been in dance films. So it made for a kind of an obvious subject. And at first I thought I'd write a dance book. But very quickly I realized that what I really wanted to talk about was my path through dance, but also the other pieces of my life that feel interlocked with it. Because as I began to think about it, I realized that that random day that I walked into Flux Flow Studio on Calumet, I was going through some really difficult things. My father had died. My beloved dog, who had been by my side for 16 years, had died. Friendship had ended. There's a lot of stuff happening. My feelings about this job that I have now retired from were starting to change. And anyway, that's what led to the book. And what I've decided to do today is I'm going to read from the beginning of an essay called On Balance, very little from that one, just to give you an idea about the dance writing. And then I'm going to go right to the beginning of the book's longest essay and the one that gave the book its title, If You Say So. I'm not going to say anything more about that, but I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions, because there are always questions. Now I have to decide if I can see better with or without my glasses. This is always a negotiation. All right, glasses are good. On balance. Yesterday was a good balance day. I knew it would be too, just minutes into class. I was solid and light, both at once. The peculiar paradox of a balance in ballet, or really just one of the peculiar paradoxes in ballet. My back felt strong, my shoulder blades drawn back and low, where the places wings would have been attached, if only I had wings. I could picture them, though. Enormous, thickly feathered, gray and white, who knows why, and brushing the floor behind me, rising with my arms as they moved into 5th position. My feet felt strong for once, too. My feet are my weakest link, but today it was as if they had roots deep below the marley floor. And my legs, knees lifted, muscles drawing outwards, planted, steady, and yet I was floating, up and up, weightless, beyond gravity. Rooted and floating. That is the confluence I am forever chasing. Ballet is a study in mixed metaphors, grounded and buoyant, solid and fluid, strong and soft, exacting, precise, and flowing. Press down and rise at the same time, descend and lift. The oppositions of ballet are a part of why I love it so. Nothing else I do embodies so much oxymoronicity. And ballet is serenely contradictory. I now find it impossible not to be charmed by the serenity of its contradictions. What remains confounding to me is the uncertainty of ballet, the zigzag of failures and success, not only from day to day, but from 1 hour to the next and from right to left. It happens while doing the exact same thing multiple times in a row. The first pirouette of a series of 3, en dehors from 4th position, might be perfectly sound, and so might be the third, but the second one will fail. And how can that be? I have never been able to be sure I will not fall out of a turn, or if I will tip dangerously forward during a no-bar shift from coupe to passe. I cannot predict whether a piqué arabesque will be graceful or ludicrously clumsy. I have this urge to demonstrate all these steps. I am not going to do it because I am wearing boots and I'd probably fall down. I've never had the urge before when reading it, so I'm not sure why today. You'd think the ups and downs of the writing life, not to mention the ups and downs of life itself, would have taught me about unpredictability, uncertainty, instability. But it's ballet that's teaching me at last to live with the not knowing what will happen and not knowing why it doesn't happen when it doesn't, why it does happen when it does. Why wonder, I remind myself. That's a question I've never asked myself before. Ballet has also taught me to make peace with my own limitations. Nothing else I have ever practiced has done that. In ballet, what choice do I have? I'm not strong. I've never been strong, not even in my youth. I have the built-in limits of my physiology, my archless feet, the angle of my natural turnout, the fact that if I try to bring my feet to 6th position, close together and in parallel, my knees smash together painfully. And I began ballet too late to ever master certain skills. I shall never be on point. I shall never achieve flight in Grand Allegro. And the day I execute a promenade correctly, I believe the studio will close as if for the observation of a national holiday. But ballet has made me curious instead of frustrated or angry or despairing about my immutable limitations. I'm immersed in how they work. I'm interested in finding strategies I might make use of to accommodate them. I've learned to set modest goals, 2 pirouettes in a row, now that I can do 1 reasonably well, on some days anyway, as well as goals that would seem to be modest, a true deep grand plie in 1st and 5th positions, but are not modest at all, not for me, and which I am aware I may not live long enough to meet. I just turned 70, but I can try. Oh, I guess I'm stopping there and going to the next part. Okay, so now I'm going to read to you from, I'll say something about this final essay. I thought the book was done. I thought the book was going to end with an essay called Animal Behavior, which is right before what is now the final essay. In fact, the original title of the collection was Animal Behavior, which my editor disliked. He said it sounded like a book about Jane Goodall, and he had a point. That long essay, novella-length essay, is about sort of the history of my relationship with my various domesticated animals. As I said, my dog Molly died right before I started dancing and started getting me thinking about the role that animals have played in my life and the roles that animals play in many people's lives. But then a close friend of mine who I danced with, who I met in the dance studio, suddenly died. And even though the rule in creative writing is emotions recollected in tranquility, I did something I've only done once before, and that was right after my father's death. I started writing about her and her death. And I wrote it in a kind of fever. And when I finished the draft, it too was novella length. I sent it to my editor and said, something tells me this belongs in the book. And he was like, stop the presses. This belongs in the book. This is the title of the book. He pointed out all the ways that themes that had been happening throughout the book reappeared in this essay. And that's why I want to read the beginning of this to you, also because it's possible that some of you know my friend. I didn't like the way it felt reading with my glasses, so I'm going to see how it feels without. If You Say So is written in named sections. The title of the first section is À chacun son goût. You've fallen in love, Judith said. We were beside each other at the bar. It was my second ever ballet class. I had surprised myself 2 days before by committing to an all-class pass that would renew itself every month, then surprised myself again by coming back to take another class so soon. I confess this as we stretched our calves, waiting for class to begin. It's my MO to talk to people I've just met as if I've known them all my life. I felt compelled to come, I told her. I felt as if I had no choice about it. That's weird, isn't it? She laughed and said what she said, then added gravely, I completely understand. She and ballet were already in a long-term relationship, she said. She'd been dancing at one studio or another for over 30 years, longer than most of these children. One hand on the bar, she waved the other simultaneously, acknowledging and dismissing everyone around us, have even been alive. Judith was an epidemiologist. Like me, she taught at the university. Neither one of us found it remarkable that we'd never crossed paths on campus. The College of Public Health and the creative writing program might as well have been in different galaxies, even though the buildings housing them were no more than a 10-minute walk apart. She was from Los Angeles, so we exchanged the customary, I can't believe I ended up here, pleasantries, required when Los Angelinos and New Yorkers meet for the first time in Central Ohio. She was also a full decade older than I. Do you know how old I am? She asked, the first of thousands of rhetorical questions she'd ask in the course of our friendship before telling me the answer. I would not have guessed that she was over 70. Was it ballet that was responsible for her well-muscled arms and back, for how slender and compact she was? I wondered, but I didn't ask, which didn't matter because Judith read my mind, this too for the first of many times. I take a daily ballet class, she said, but I also lift weights. I work with a trainer. He's very good. She looked me up and down. Shall I give you his number? Was I insulted? I decided not. I was soft and weak-looking, and especially as compared to Judith, fat. She was only saying out loud what was obvious, and perhaps she too had a tendency to talk to perfect strangers as if she already knew them. This, I would discover, was exactly right, even if her way of doing so was markedly unlike my own. I told her I had tried weightlifting, that I had tried just about every form of exercise there was and had found them all not to my liking. Running had been my least favorite. Lifting weights was a close second. Really, Judith said. How odd. I enjoy it. I like feeling strong. She flexed her right bicep and glanced at it admiringly before she let it go and shrugged. À chacun son goût, n'est-ce pas? Then, oh well, never mind. She sang those 4 words, not pleasantly, I thought, as if she had concluded she could not be bothered with me. Then I was insulted. So much for my first ballet friend, I remember thinking. But Judith grew on me. We saw each other in class nearly every day, and every day we talked. I felt that I began to understand her. Her tone, I came to see, could not be interpreted the way anybody else's would. That is, When she sounded condescending or dismissive, it didn't mean she felt that way. Her disapproving tone was something like a reflex or a habit that she wasn't quite aware of. Or she'd say something that sounded critical or even ominous, but was only her way, her odd, very special Judith way of being friendly. She always arrived before anybody else, a good 15 or 20 minutes early, and took the same spot, dead center at the bar mounted across the studio's eastern wall. I was next most days, and I'd take the space beside her. At first, because it seemed rude not to. If I picked a spot farther away, when there were just the two of us, wouldn't it look like I was avoiding her? But then soon enough, because that was my spot, in front of her when we did the combination for the first time, behind her when we turned to do them on the left. Greetings, she would say when I arrived. I was wondering when you'd finally get here. But I was always early too. Not as early as Judith, of course, but still well before the class's start time. I learned not to protest. If I did, she'd sniff and say, well, if you say so, in a way that suggested she was going easy on me. She did not, in fact, go easy on anyone. But, as she herself would have said, this was one of her charms. And I was charmed. Until I met Judith, I had always been the most forthright and outspoken person in any room I was in. I enjoyed ceding the crown. One day, no more than a few weeks into our acquaintance, Judith said, it sounded like an accusation, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" I said I was. "I am too," she said. Supposedly. There was a dramatic pause before she lowered her voice. "So they tell me." I was accustomed to Judith's theatricality by then. I laughed. I said, "Who's they?" "Oh, the royal they," she said, with that little wave to which I'd also become well accustomed. But you see, my father was Jewish. So was my mother, actually, but she died when I was very young. I don't remember her. My father married a Gentile, and she was the one who raised me, so I was raised Christian. Not that I believed any of that garbage, even as a child. I mean, who would? And therefore, I suppose I'm not really very Jewish after all, am I? It was hard to know how to answer this, or if an answer was required, so I didn't try. This would turn out to be a long-term feature, not even a bug, of our relationship. As would Judith soldiering on unfazed. But people tell me I seem Jewish. What do you think? Do I seem Jewish to you? I'm not sure I understand the question, I said carefully. I was pretty sure I did. "Oh, yes, you do," she said. "When I'm in Sweden, and I am frequently in Sweden, people ask if I'm Italian. I imagine this is because I'm not blonde and blue-eyed as they all are. But here, the assumption is that I'm Jewish. Do I look Jewish to you? Or do you think it's that I exhibit certain personality traits that Americans, particularly in the Midwest, associate with Jewishness? I talk a lot. I ask a lot of questions. And I'm argumentative. I have opinions. Something I can only assume I learned from my father. He was argumentative. He had something to say about everything, and he used to have all these people, men, obviously, over, and all of them would be talking loudly, yelling, debating whatever position one of them had staked out, all of them talking at the same time, and I'd be there listening, and sometimes I'd have a thought about what they were talking about, and so I'd try to get a word in, and the men would talk over me or shush me, and my father would roar at them, "Let the child talk. She has something to say." Whereas my mother, my stepmother, but as she was the only mother I ever knew, I called her my mother, preferred that I stay quiet. She wanted me to behave. I suppose she was more of a children should be seen and not heard kind of parent, which is not the way Jews do things, is it? Before I could decide if this was another rhetorical question, or if she really wondered and thought I would know the answer, and thought I would willingly provide it in a room full of people I was 99% sure did not include a single other person who was Jewish, our teacher, Philly, called out, "Today, let's start face à la barre, feet parallel, and walk it out," and the conversation ended. That particular bit of it ended, anyway. The conversation about Jewishness and about her father, they were intertwined for her, stopped and started many times. We had other subjects too. We talked about our teachers, Russ and Feely, the couple who owned the studio, about how encouraging and warm they were, how patient and kind, and so charming, Judith always added. Charming was one of her pet words. She told me how lucky I was, starting out with them as my teachers. By this time, she had given up taking class at the other studios in town. She sometimes badmouthed them, and Russ or Feely would ask her to stop. Please, Judith, Russ would say, it's bad form, and Judith would tell him, well, I don't see why, I'm just saying what's true. We talked about how beautifully the two of them managed the high wire act of all good teaching, balancing rigor and nurturing, challenging and sweetly supporting us, being both exacting and forgiving, serious and lighthearted. Oh, and such beautiful dancers, we said. We'd both fallen a little bit in love with both of them, we acknowledged to each other sheepishly. Or, I should say, I was sheepish. Judith was defiant. We also talked about the classes we'd be teaching come the fall in our worlds-apart departments, and about our students, almost all of whom we loved, and our colleagues. We did not love very many of them. Loved you, Susan. We talked about my writing, her research. She was studying the relationship between the immune system and glioblastoma, a rare and particularly deadly form of brain cancer. I'd just finished writing a novel about a young magician and his father, the magician's aspiring poet wife, her mother, and her poet mentor. Sounds complicated, Judith said. This did not sound like a compliment. Not as complicated as your research, I said. This made Judith smile, a smile that disarmed me, always. Making her smile made me feel triumphant, always. And I often made her smile. I'm proud of that. She was not an easy room to work. The next section is called If You Say So. A ritual developed. I would take my place beside her at the bar on the eastern wall, and we would exchange greetings. Then she would tell me about something she'd read in that day's New York Times. I'd tell her I'd read that story too. I always had. We both read the paper cover to cover every morning over breakfast. But Judith was undaunted. She just kept talking, telling me about it in agonizing detail until it was time for class to start. This was both annoying and oddly familiar, although it took some time before I realized why that was. My father used to read me stories from the Times as I sat across from him at breakfast when I visited from wherever I was living. He had done this for 30 years since I'd first left New York for Iowa for grad school. He too wouldn't stop even if I told him I'd already read the article myself. Once he gets started, it seemed he couldn't stop. He had no brakes. That's how I see it now. No brakes and no reverse gear either. Judith was like that too. This made me feel tender toward her, protective of her, just as I had always felt about my father, whom I'd loved and been infuriated by, who had loved me wholeheartedly, and who, for my entire childhood, had made me his captive audience. My father had been gone just over 3 years when I first met Judith. Judith spoke so often of her father, his left-wing political leanings, his loudness, his argumentative nature. I sometimes felt as if I'd known him too. I thought I could imagine him as he held court. Nobody had stronger opinions than my father, she would tell me, as if she'd never told me this before. Oh, and that booming voice, likewise. Was this because he was from New York, she wanted to know? Weren't all New Yorkers like this? Or was it because he was Jewish? After a while, I knew better than to try to answer her. Judith liked to ask and answer her own questions. Who knows, she'd say. Or, well, what difference does it make? And then, it's very Jewish of me, isn't it, to answer a question with a question? I would smile. Or, if I was feeling mischievous, I might say, really, is it? And after a beat, she'd smile too. Very funny, she'd say. When she talked about her father, there would always come a point when she would sigh and say, it's him I take after. Looking back, it seems to me inevitable that we would be friends. It wasn't that we had so much in common. We did not, other than a shared devotion to ballet, to our own work, and to our teaching. The way we lived was as different as our disciplines. My house filled to the brim with mementos, tchotchkes, and framed photographs, in rooms crammed with too much antique furniture. Judith's, which she had been renting for close to 30 years, almost wholly unadorned and unfurnished but for a threadbare Goodwill sofa and 2 battered canvas director's chairs, a tile-top dining table ringed by a set of black plastic chairs, a bed for her and a futon for her dog, Lucy, and an office that was fully outfitted for working while standing up. She disdained television, stand-up comedy, most musicals, movie or theatrical, and pop music, excluding Motown and Bob Dylan, neither of which she would allow to be called pop in her presence. And a couple of the songs Russ used in his dance karaoke class, in which Judith was a faithful weekly participant. Gail's ABCDEFU and Cardi B's Bodak Yellow, though mostly for their lyrics. I will read you a sample lyric, the opening lines of ABCDEFU, but if you're sensitive to 4-letter words, you might want to plug your ears. We played that at her memorial service, by the way. It really shocked her colleagues. For 6.5 years, 6 days a week, Judith and I danced together. I stood behind her at the bar, admiring her back, her épaulement, the grace and self-assurance of her port-de-bras. When we danced on the diagonal across the room, for years, she'd always joined the first group, though never claimed the first position, or the one down stage, because while she was confident about the execution of the steps in any given combination, she was never able to remember what the combinations were. I always hung back to dance in the last or next to last group. This gave me time to prepare, to work up my nerve, to practice the combination in my mind, and to watch Judith as she moved across the floor, the back point of the triangle she made with Brad and Rian, or Lauren and Mal. On Fridays, when there were no classes for us at the studio, before they started offering yoga, we checked in by text, me, or a phone call, Judith. On weekend evenings, after a long afternoon of classes, sometimes we'd go out to dinner, but dinner out with Judith was never a very satisfying enterprise since she found menus baffling, would ask me to order for her. "Oh, you know what I like," she'd say with that little wave, and then eat almost nothing, insisting always that she wasn't hungry. We went to the movies only a few times. She pronounced Once Upon a Time in Hollywood boring, and I said, "Boring? With all that gory violence?" and shuddered. I had been enjoying the movie up till the fight scene at the end, and Judith said, "Should have been more of it and started sooner." And Barbie, utterly stupid, Judith said. We went off into the ballet and to dance concerts at the university. When she was outrageous, just being Judith, as we'd say, calling out from where she sat in the anteroom's only chair, "Welcome to Dancers Anonymous," each time the door opened, or making jokes that upset some people. On the day the Proud Boys demonstrated in Columbus and a lot of us were shaken, they'd marched fully armed right by our homes in the neighborhood most of us lived in. Judith came through the door declaring, "I've decided that I'm going to join the Proud Boys." I did what I could. "She doesn't mean it, it's meant to be a joke." Then pulled her aside to beg her, once again, to think before she spoke. And sometimes she would, but she might say something offensive even if she had thought about it first, because it was funny, she'd insist afterwards. She was forever hurting or insulting people without meaning to, choosing as her gesture in response to a note plucked on a harp as we rehearsed a piece we were performing in an art gallery, and others' gestures were wriggles or spins, jazz hands, air guitar, ballet port-de-bras, you get the picture, to raise her third finger, which profoundly disturbed the woman she had made the gesture to. "It was a joke," Judith told me later. Has she no sense of humor? And when I told her that giving somebody the finger wasn't a good joke, and in that context, especially of gesture as delicious movement, meant to invite a delicious movement in response, it wasn't funny in the least. She told me I had no sense of humor either. She'd mock threatened to sue Russ and Feely, or Scott, who danced with us and was a massage therapist. Judith had gone to see him. She told me he'd helped her, that he was a wonder. or she threatened to write a bad Yelp review. She was always surprised when people were offended. She was difficult. I recognized that. I'd seen it myself early on, hadn't I? My patience with her might have been greater than that of some of the others at the studio, and I would learn many of her colleagues at the university, because I felt that I knew her heart. I knew she wasn't mean, wasn't malicious, truly thought that she was being funny, even when, and perhaps especially when, she did or said something that seemed harsh or callous. My father, too, hardly ever stopped to think before he spoke, told awful and sometimes offensive jokes, was hurt if people didn't laugh, and even more hurt if they said they were hurt. But, like Judith, my father wasn't mean. He was kind. He was generous to a fault. Sorry, I'm moving around a little bit here. He helped put my best friend through law school in the 1980s and financed the production of a demo for a young singer he and my mother had met on one of their cruises. Judith would give you the shirt off her back. I once witnessed her give someone she'd met for the first time, who'd mentioned that her feet hurt, the socks off her own feet. Try these, she said. They're very good compression socks. I just put them on this minute, so they're not sweaty. See if they help you. And if someone said that something she was wearing was pretty or cool or chic or looked comfortable, she'd order another one like it as soon as she got home, and a few days later, she'd hand it over in the studio's anteroom before class, usually saying something like, I don't know how or why, but this landed in my mailbox. You should have it. I'd known her less than a year when she insisted that I make use of her car for a month while she was away on a research project, and I was carless in Columbus. Len was spending the summer as artist in residence over 800 miles away. Of course, first she scolded me for letting him have the car. We had just the one, calling me a prisoner of the patriarchy. Then, what's mine is yours, she said. I had never heard that phrase uttered without irony before. I guess what I'm saying is that it was easier for me to be patient with her because she reminded me so much of my father. They were both so immoderate. When my father liked someone, he would do anything for them, whether they wanted him to or not. He threw himself into solving his friends' problems, legal, medical, financial, psychological, with so much energy and information and enthusiasm, the people he was helping were often disconcerted or chagrined, or both. I will admit that in this latter way, I'm the one who's like my father. I'm like him in many ways. I'm social, helpful, garrulous, warm, bossy, a Butinsky, anxious, eager to please, not easily daunted, unrelenting, actually. I'm always having ideas, big and small, and I'm quick, too quick sometimes, to put them into action. I'm loyal, a devoted friend, a dedicated fan of everyone I love, until they've done something to hurt me. Then I hold a grudge forever. I am too easily hurt. I'm not hardy, although, like my father, I give every appearance of being so. Judith was like my father in some of the ways I am, but she was also like him in some of the ways I'm not. She might have been the sister I never had. I wish she'd been my sister. I wish she'd had my father instead of hers. I wish she'd had a father who, like mine, thought the world of his only daughter. It was not until her death in November 2023 that I knew enough to wish that for her. Only after she was gone that I understood how little I had known about her. Still, I can see now that there were things she told me in the last weeks of her life that pointed to some of what I would learn later on. She mentioned these things nonchalantly, as if what she was saying was part of an ongoing conversation, as if they weren't revelations. Her long estrangement from her father, for example, which she spoke of for the first time while we were driving home together after the memorial service for our friend Annie, who had danced with us for years. Judith had done very well that day, saving her complaints. Why on earth did there have to be so much God in what that guy said? And why was it so long? It just went on, until we were walking to my car. He's a minister, I said. That guy, that's his job. And the service was long, but none of it was boring, was it? That's unusual. I wouldn't know, she said. I've never been to such a thing before. That startled me. How does one get to be in her 70s without a single funeral? But I let it go. I told her this one had been unique in my experience. It had been both wise and comforting, inclusive, loving, specific to Annie in every way, and filled with wonderful music. I don't much like churches either. Honestly, I'm not even all that comfortable in most synagogues, but I'd like this service. What I'd been thinking during it was, everyone deserves a memorial like this one, to be celebrated, honored, recognized for who they were, without a note of falsity, without generalization, beautifully and realistically, with people who knew them well and loved them well, speaking eloquently about them, telling good stories, letting the rest of us know things we hadn't known before. If you say so, Judith said. I laughed. Judith, my darling, I said, must you always search out the negative? Can't you just try to appreciate what was good about it? Oh, yes, that familiar wave. I do. And there was a lot that was very nice. It's not my fault that I can't focus on that, don't you know? The negative searches me out. We had reached my car. I had unlocked it. Judith paused before getting in. It's sometimes a problem, she said. Wistfully, I thought. And Judith was so rarely wistful. And then, as we settled in for the drive home, she said, you know, I didn't even find out about my father's death until afterwards. If there was any kind of service, I wasn't there. I hadn't talked to him in years. I knew enough to know that I was not supposed to sound surprised, not supposed to make what Judith would derisively call a big deal out of this. I made sure to sound as casual, as matter-of-fact as she had. How'd you find out? My brother, my half-brother, Eric, called to tell me. Ah, I said. I knew about the half-brother, knew that he existed. I hadn't known his name. Then I asked her what the cause of the estrangement had been, and it was just as if a door slammed shut between us in the front seat of my ancient Volvo. As if, in saying anything at all about this, she'd forgotten herself briefly, had let a door that had been firmly closed swing open without meaning to. Not worth talking about, she said. She said this coldly. She turned her head away, looking out the passenger side window at the bleak suburban landscape. Also in those last weeks, but of course she could not have known they were her last weeks, she mentioned her half-brother's name again, as well as where he lived, what sort of work he did, and, dryly, that he was born again. She mentioned that they had been talking regularly on the phone for a while now. She didn't wait for me to ask, but volunteered that in these conversations they mainly argued politics. There was a cousin, too, Jean in Los Angeles, whom she'd never before spoken of to me. Now she told me, once again, as if in passing, as if I already knew, that they talked weekly, that they'd been doing so for years. After Judith's death, when I talked to Jean myself, she told me it had been her husband, Jack, who'd been Judith's cousin. But she and I were always close. She was one of my best friends. I learned in the days and weeks following her death that many people had considered Judith one of their best or even their one best friend. There was the woman I'd met once who'd taken an instant visible dislike to me. She was Judith's friend of over 30 years and worshipped her. She had told Judith that she'd been appalled by the disrespectful way I talked to her at the dinner party where we met. Contradicting and scolding me, Judith reported, criticizing me, telling me what I should and shouldn't be making jokes about. We were walking arm in arm. Both of us were feeling shaky, across the parking lot of the church where the service for our friend Annie was being held. What had provoked her to tell me what her friend had said was my cautioning her, as we got out of the car, against making any jokes about death today, no matter how nervous she felt. Now she said, see, some people find me absolutely delightful precisely as I am. So, are you finally convinced I'm perfect? Yes, I said. I will never again beg you to please count to 10 before you speak. Excellent, said Judith. She squeezed my arm tighter. Do you mean that? I do not, I told her, but I squeezed back. I love you anyway, I said. Ce n'est pas possible, Judith said. I didn't know if she meant pausing to think before she spoke or that I loved her. I knew it was better not to ask. I'm going to stop there. Drink some water. So I have at least 20 minutes to answer your questions. I'm stopping, yes. Oh, I mean, I could keep going endlessly. You know, thank you. I will tell you this, this book, like all my other books, did not sell audio rights. I mean, nobody ever even inquired. And so many people, when this one came out, it came out last spring, said, I'm going to wait for the audiobook, or, you know, I just don't read books anymore. I only listen to books. That I thought I'm going to take matters into my own hands. And I have been recording all my books. I've been going into the sound studio we have in the basement of Denny Hall, my own building, my old building, I guess I should say. And I finished this one. And I've also finished, actually the one that's available to buy now on Amazon is my novel Dog, which I did first because it's the shortest of my books and I wanted to see how that went. It was fun. So I just finished reading this one out loud. So anyway, yes. Dog. So Dog was my There But For the Grace of God story, because when I got the dog who became my most beloved companion, it was supposed to be for my daughter. She was a puppy, a mutt that we'd rescued. And I remember being out one night, walking her, it was like midnight, trying to get her to do her business and thinking, this dog has taken over my life. And then immediately realizing how ridiculous that was. A full-time teaching job. I have my writing. I've got my husband who requires a lot of caretaking. I had a daughter who was only 8 years old at the time. But I started thinking, what if? Like, what would it take for a dog to take over my life? And that's kind of how everything I've ever written, every piece of fiction I've ever written has gone, is a what if. And I thought, if I'd never met my husband, because I moved here, bought a house my second year of teaching in 1989, and never expected to marry, never intended or wanted to marry, but met my husband and had a child, and what had seemed like a huge house suddenly became a very tiny house. And I thought, well, what if that was the path? And I had just gone along that path. And thus was invented J.T. Rosen, the poet and English professor, who has lived a solitary life for years and is past middle age and adopts a dog almost by accident, and it changes her life. So it's a quiet little book. Many people bought it because the cover was adorable. It was the cutest dog you've ever seen, and then were very disappointed to find out that it was not a cute book about a dog, but it was about a spinster poet. There's a lot of poetry in it. But then other people liked it. It was actually my most successful book, translated into other languages and all. That's Dog. So Dog is available on audiobook if you enjoyed hearing the sound of my voice. This one will be available within weeks. Anything else? Yeah. So Judith, I tell the story in this essay, but slowly. And this is the way I tend to tell my stories. She started having seizures, which it took some time to be diagnosed as late onset epilepsy, which evidently is more common than I knew. And she hated the seizure medication. It would keep her from having seizures, but it made her groggy. She couldn't dance because her balance was off. She couldn't do her work and her research. Her ballet and her research were ballet research and her teaching. That was her life. So she would reduce the dose until she got to the point where she could do what she wanted to do, and then she would have another seizure. And one night she had a massive seizure, and the details of her death are too grotesque to talk about, but the seizure didn't kill her, but she died. And at that point, she had a roommate, a young roommate, a woman we danced with, who I insisted she have move in with her. And she said at the time to everyone, I always do what Michelle tells me to do, which was not true. But she did listen that time, and her roommate was there to find her. It was very, very shocking. And we did have a memorial for her, a celebration of her life that was everything I had said everyone's should be. And we danced in her honor. We had it at the studio. So, did any of you know her? Oh, that's good. Well, Susan knew her a little, right? Yeah. Judith Schwartzbaum, epidemiology, a one-of-a-kind person. Nothing else? You want me to show you? Oh, somebody.
Thanks very much for that, Michelle. It was really interesting. Could you talk a little about your process? I was curious about, did you keep a lot of notes?
No, I had never thought I would write about her, but she was in, I had written a bunch of dance essays. Oh, so now, okay, I'll back up. So I didn't at first think there was anything to say about dance. I was using dance. I wrote a novella about where the main character was a former dancer who had become a psychologist, and dance comes back into her life. And then a friend of mine who works at Slate, who had edited something of mine years and years before at a different magazine, sent me a text and said, because I've been talking on Facebook, I'm very vocal on Facebook, feel free to friend me. I've been talking a lot about dance on Facebook, and he texted me and said, do you think there's an essay in starting to dance at age 62? And I said, do you think there's an essay? And he said, yes, I think there's 1,800 words. We'll pay you X amount of dollars. You should write it. So I did, and that was the first thing I wrote about dance. And then it was off to the races. I wrote something for Columbus Monthly. I wrote, a more literary essay that I placed in a literary magazine. Judith appeared in all of them because she was because she was there with me at my second ever class. And she was in every single class with me after that. And because we became so close, and it was so unlikely. So while I didn't have notes, I don't take notes, I don't keep a journal or a diary. I had my own essays to look back at that I had written in the moment of things happening, which just opened up lots of memories. Now, this dialogue that I am reporting, is it precise? No. And there are multiple schools of thoughts about this when it comes to what's generally called creative nonfiction, as opposed to non-creative nonfiction, right? Which every single scholar writes, one has to. There are those, like me, who believe that it's kind of baked into the form. This is not journalism, and you do your best to recreate. And the contract with the reader is that they understand that. But there are people who feel strongly that if you can't say exactly what was actually said, you need to say that. And that feels clunky to me. There are people who are all the way at an extreme where they don't even think what you write about has to be true. People fictionalize their own memoirs, and I feel like that's a violation of the contract with the reader. But I've been talking to students about this for years. We all have to kind of figure this out. Now, when my daughter was a child, I wrote about her a lot. There's only one essay about her in this book, and she's very relieved. She's 32 now, and she's just glad I finally stopped writing about her. And the essay about her was one I wrote a long time ago that just sort of slotted into this book. But when she was 7, 8 years old, she would come to my readings. And I will never forget a reading in Denny Hall in the Commons room there. It was a student faculty reading, and I was reading from my first nonfiction book, which was all about her. And she actually stood up and said, she's making me sound smarter than I really was. There we are. I said, I am not. You are actually that. In the case of my daughter, the only time in my life I've ever kept a journal was for her, because I had to write down the brilliant, you know how you are if you have kids, right? The brilliant things she said. So I had proof, which she refused to accept. But mostly I am kind of reinventing. I do have a very clear memory of walking from the car to the church for my friend Annie's memorial service, and then walking out afterwards, in part because she died 2 weeks later, and in part because it was such a, the moments that we remember best tend to be the most heightened. And it was she was also a friend. We were not close, but we had been dancing together for years. And she was the identical twin of someone else we danced with, and she died in a car accident. So it was really a brutal, shocking thing. So those kinds of moments are really with me. I don't know if our first conversation was exactly as I reported, but it was a version of that, for sure. She definitely asked me if I was Jewish, for example. Yeah, yeah.
Michelle, Susan Petrie has a question for you.
Oh.
If you want to address that.
Hi, Susan. Oh, it's written down. I see. Has your writing changed since taking up dance? New sensitivities to, I didn't even realize I had this. Cool. Well, that's interesting. No. My writing has changed only in that I write so much about it. I find that even when I'm writing not about dance, dance makes its way into what I'm writing. But my kind of DNA as a writer, and it's weird because I think this has been true since I know it's true since my earliest days. I don't have in my possession the writing I did at 7 and 8, but I do have the novel I wrote when I was 10. And aside from its silliness, like the novel was about adults, and the way I made it clear that these were adults was they said damn all the time. Like, I'll never really, the man comes into the room where his wife is having breakfast, and he says, damn, honey, I had the strangest dream. And she says, damn it, what was it about? But the general style is mine. It's very evidently mine, which is kind of wild for me. But I think that's true. In a way, I feel like, are you still the same person you were when you were a teenager? I mean, you're smarter now, you're wiser. With any luck, you have more ability to regulate your emotions and better decision-making powers, but you're the same person. And you're the same person in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s and so on. I feel the same way about writing. When I look at the first writing I published in my 20s, I see my psychic fingerprint there. I see certain tendencies there. Even though I'm a better writer now and I'm smarter, et cetera, but it's still me. And so I think dance was not going to change that DNA. Even, it's an interesting question, Susan, because I don't write very much about physicality. I described Judith a little bit in this because it was really important to sort of see her the way I saw her the first time I saw her, because it was shocking to me. I mean, this was a tiny little woman. I'm small. She was up to here. She probably weighed 90 pounds, and she had really muscled arms. But normally, I don't talk about what people wear. You'll notice there's none of that here. And that kind of observational thing that some writers do in great detail has never been my thing. I've always been more interested in what people are feeling and what they're thinking and what their relationships are. But recently I wrote my first ever novel for kids. I wrote a middle grade novel, hasn't been published yet. And after I'd written a couple of drafts of it, I had some 11 and 12-year-olds read it for me to give me feedback. And I got great feedback from these kids. And I learned so much about what it's like to be 11 and 12 now. But my best reader, who gets a full credit in the book, was a girl named Ruby Stewart, who at the time was 11 and in 7th grade, so a precocious kid, who said, you need to tell the reader what they're wearing. We really care about that. We can't, like, it's just not going to make sense to us. And I said, okay, well, what do you think they're wearing? And she knew. She had in her head, she gave me like down to brands. And that, we ended up in such an interesting conversation. And I did go back through the book and thought, oh, and this really, in the case of this book, this really does kind of enrich it. But you know, the physical stuff, what things look like, and even what they feel like, which is really new to me. I mean, 8 years into dancing every day, it's still a revelation. Like it doesn't come naturally to me. And that's one of the reasons I like it so much, is because it is so completely different from what I do with the rest of my time. I really am a person who never lived in her body. I always felt, I've written about this at length, I always felt like my body was just a container for my brain. I had a good brain, and I had to take some kind of care of this container. But except when I was pregnant, when I loved my body, it was the first time in my life I was just, look at this magnificent thing, when it literally was a container, but it was a container for someone else. I just never really thought about it. And I moved through the world differently. And I feel different, and my body has changed. I mean, you can't dance 6 days a week for 8 years without your body changing. And I'm stronger. But that's like, in a way, and this may be going too far, I'm thinking about Susan's question, but it's walled off from my writing, maybe in the same way that I walk into the dance studio, and one of the greatest things about it is whatever I've been working on all day, everything is gone. I'm not thinking about, not worrying about, that sentence I got stuck on or what's going to happen next in the novel. I'm not thinking about anything except, okay, here I am at the bar and I'm ready. And I've never done anything that gave me a chance to do that. So it may be that I'm like, okay, my experience of dance is here and my experience of writing is here. But now you got me thinking about it. So, it's possible that that will change now. And if so, I will blame you, Susan.
Thanks, Michelle.
Oh, a microphone is coming.
Wonderful lecture, by the way, or reading, by the way. Thank you so much. I texted my neighbor, Ted, who was in the epidemiology department, and he said, oh, I knew Judith. She was a hoot.
Well, I'm glad he said that she was a hoot, because I did learn, I knew while she was alive that she had many colleagues who really disliked her. But what I found out after she died is that she had quite a few who really loved her, because I did let the whole epidemiology department know about this memorial, and throngs of graduate students came, which made me really happy. Yeah. Yeah, oh, she was a hoot. But she was, I mean, I didn't pull any punches. I mean, she really deeply offended. And there were times that she really upset me, and I'd stop speaking to her for days because I was so angry. But in the end, yeah. I have met people in other areas in the sciences that I guess must have encountered her for some reason, who were, when I mentioned Judith, were like, oh God, Judith Schwartzbaum? No, cannot tolerate that person. But, yeah, KB. Oh, so for a long time, I was really like completely stuck on the dead Russians. That was always my answer. And I still, I'm going through my books now and trying to get rid of books because I'm going to move in a year. And I'm not getting rid of my Chekhov or my Tolstoy, although I am willingly getting rid of Dostoevsky, but that's another story. But I have, in recent years, started really like deeply investing in living writers. So Tessa Hadley, who publishes stories in the New Yorker, I discovered her when I was in London on sabbatical, right before I started dancing, actually. And bookstores in London, I walked in and said, I want to know about some British women writers I've never heard of. And they handed me, this young man gleefully went around the store and handed me a stack of books. And Tessa Hadley was the one that really stuck with me. I'm going to get stuck, and there's no reason for me to get stuck. And I do the All Sides book show with Chris Purdy, and so once a month I have to recommend books. So I'm thinking about what I've read recently that I've loved. I'm going to mangle her name, Chimamaki Adichie, the Nigerian writer. In addition to Americana, which a lot of people have read, her latest book, Dream Count, is just gorgeous and inspiring. I used to read Alice Munro with devotion, but I'm trying to decide what to do with her books, actually. That's, for those who don't know, Alice Munro is a treasured fiction writer who we have learned was really a kind of a terrible person. It's just very hard to separate. And talk again, I get about that wall. It's always hard. Yeah, you know, I was making a list because the next book show is going to be on Halloween, and I know that the others on the panel will want to bring in scary books. I don't read scary books, and I decided I was going to bring in a list of anti-scary books, comforting books. And I was surprised at how many comforting books I could think of. Have you ever read Laurie Colwin? Do you know it? Right? So, yeah. And her books about food are really some of the most comforting books you'd ever want to read. And I can't say that she's an inspiration, but she's kind of a glimmering object in the sky for me, because she writes, I think, beautifully written books that are so easy to read, that are so light somehow. And I feel like sometimes, not that reading me is drudgery, I would never say that. I think reading me is a pleasure, but it's not an uncomplicated pleasure. Let's put it that way.
How about Barbara Kingsolver's Small Wonders?
I have never read Barbara Kingsolver's Small Wonders. And if that is a comforting book, I actually have not read much Kingsolver at all. So that needs, one of the things that's happening as I start going through my belongings, because I know it's going to take me a full year to get through everything, is realizing how many books I own that I've bought and not read yet. And so I'm making a whole separate, because those are going with me for sure. That's easy. The hard ones are the ones I've already read that I know I'm not going to, at this stage, there's not enough time left to reread, as far as I'm concerned. The books I know I'm not going to reread, but that I can't part with, you know. But I already parted with, when I retired, I gave away over 1,000 books to students. It was very satisfying. All I kept from the books I had in my office were books that were written by former students of mine and signed to me. And now I'm even looking at them. Elizabeth, when yours comes out, I will keep yours forever. That's one of my former graduate students back there. She works for OSU Press now. But I'm going through them and thinking, nah, I don't really care about that. And keeping the ones from my most beloved students. So, yeah, I mean, Ann Tyler is another writer I just treasure. I would give anything to write something that was as transporting. You know, you start an Elizabeth Strout, now that I'm going. These are all, you know, these are all writers who I feel like I just fall into their books. If I start one of them, I don't get up from the couch until I've finished it. And that's really sort of my test of like a writer I love most. Yeah, sure. 5:04. I think we're done. Are we done? I'm looking at you. Oh, no? I can take one last question if someone has one. Otherwise, I will thank you. As I say, I have copies of the book if you're interested, or if you just want to look at it and see the beautiful paintings in it. Thanks for listening.